Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Shin Wei. I'm working with Penang Green Council. I would like to welcome you to this webinar, and thank you for joining us today. So this webinar is the first of 5 webinar series that focuses on climate change in Penang. The objectives of the webinar series Climate Change in Penang are to awareness of climate change that we are facing and what we should do. So on this particular seminar, we'll be looking at the climate change impact on Penang, and this discussion, my presentation later, is based on a review paper that my colleagues in PGC are working on, so Mela, Navin, and Tong. So the paper looks at it compiles the studies that are out there looking at specific issues regarding climate change, how climate change will have an impact in Penang. And the paper is part of our wider initiative, Penang Green Agenda 2030, information of which you can find on our website. So this webinar particularly is setting the scene for the following 4 webinars that we're going to have in this series. So in this webinar, unfortunately, we'll be talking a lot about venues. So what's going to happen, how our lives are going to be impacted in Penang, how ecosystems are going to be impacted. And then in the following 4 series, we'll be talking about solutions, in particular disaster management and water and biodiversity. So before I start, there are some caveats I have to put forward regarding this paper and the presentation I'm going to make. One is that it's by no means comprehensive. So we have collected some useful information, but we are still waiting to receive some data, or in some cases, data don't exist. So we are here today not saying, we're not telling you that we have the most comprehensive data on climate change impact of Penang. It's far from that, but this is a start, we think, that will generate the discussion in Penang. So the format of today's webinar will be the following. So I am the moderator, as well as the presenter for the first section of the webinar. So I'll be going through some issues that have been picked up by the review paper. And my discussion staff of USM, she will be giving comments to us on the paper, as well as me perhaps going deeper into some issues that she's an expert in, for example, perhaps agriculture, food security. Her presentation will be followed by Professor Zul, who is from CIMAX USM. Again, he will be giving us comments on the paper, as well as delving deeper into areas of his expertise. So after this, it will be an open session for Q&A. We will be collecting questions throughout the whole webinar. Please post your questions or comments on the comment section, and we will pick them up. Some of them we will pick them up and answer them after all the presentations. So before I start, there's just a couple of housekeeping rules. As we are hosting a webinar, if we are cut off, please don't panic. Just wait for 1 or 2 minutes and try to connect. If it's cut off on your end, please log in again with the username and password that we sent. If it's cut off our end, we will try to reconnect within 1 or 2 minutes. And also we will mute, unfortunately, we will mute all your microphones and also videos so that the presenters can really focus on their slides. So with that, actually before I start, I would like to introduce generally the whole panel for this webinar today. So we have me, Shin Wei, and then we have Dr. Kam, we have Prof. Zul. We also have 3 members from PGC, Mela, Navin, and Tantung, who have been working on this review paper. Okay, so I believe all of you can see my slides on the screen. The title of the webinar today is Climate Change Impact on Penang. Sorry, a bit of. Okay, so table of contents is as follows. So I'll be going through very briefly on the trends of climate change, globally, regionally, and locally. Then I'll focus more on the impact of this climate change on Penang, in particular in these following areas: food security, water security, flood, landslide, heat wave, and diseases. So first of all, trends. This is the global trends. Globally, global temperature has been increasing, as you can see on the graph on the left, and on the right is the prediction of where we are heading to. And even in the optimistic policies, you know, where the pledges of countries under the Paris Agreement are fulfilled, we are still heading towards 2.8 degree increase in temperature by 2100. So the trend is going to get hotter, and it's not abating at this stage, looking at the actions of governments. So this is another trend globally. Global mean sea level has been rising since 1880, and it has risen by about 21 to 24 centimeters since 1880, and about a third of that took place over the last 2.5 decades. And also the rate of sea level rise has doubled from 1.4 millimeters per year throughout most of the last century to 3.6 millimeter per year from 2006 and 2006 to 2015. So this next slide is regional trends. So we looked at the global trends of climate change. How does that impact on particular regions in the world? So in our region, our climate is very much affected by ENSO and El Nino and La Nina phenomena. So this graph shows that global warming was the effect of El Nino southern oscillation. So during El Nino, our temperature will get hotter and drier, and as you can see in the graph, the contribution or the increase in temperature that is attributed to the global warming has been increasing. So that's the purple line. The blue line is the increase in temperature that can be attributed to El Nino. And El Nino happens in cycle. It doesn't happen every year. So you see that in some years, it's the attribution is particularly high, some years not. But as you can see, the trend showing global warming, the impact globally, we want to look at Malaysia, and particularly the northern part of Malaysia. It's really tricky for scientists to change is not caused by climate change. But even with the uncertainty in terms of climate modeling, which is getting better every year, you can see certain trends rising. The graph on the left is showing the temperature increase. So in the past 20, 30 years, we see that the mean temperature is increasing. This is in the North Peninsula of Malaysia, so it includes Penang. The graph on the right is showing the trend of increasing rainfall. And also, according to Brian Lepas Climate Station, which has been collecting mean temperature of the locality from 1951 to 2018, there has been an increase of mean temperature of 1.5 degrees Celsius, just for the past 50, 60 years. So to sum up, local weather, our climate, our local climate weather is getting hotter as well as wetter. So what do they translate? How does this translate? This global trend, regional trend, and local trend in terms of increase, how do they translate into impact in Penang? That's what we're gonna look at. So this graph generally, sorry, I apologize if it looks a bit messy. It's sort of show the different impacts of climate change. So at the top, we have global warming, meaning that with climate change, overall temperature of the primary impact are heat wave, we have droughts, perhaps we have sea level rise and warming. Sea level rise is caused by the expansion of seawater because it's hotter, and also melting of sea ice. we will also have more storms and increased rainfall. So all of this, and also the direct impact of warming, will contribute to species loss. So certain species that cannot withstand the increase in temperature, or their habitats are washed away by floods or inundated by sea level rise, all this will result in species loss, which is already a trend. And the secondary impact of all these drought, heat waves, sea level rise, storms are the following. So there will be more wildfires. They will cause increased food and water insecurity. It will cause permanent loss of land. It will cause floods. It will cause landslides. So these are some of the secondary impacts of climate change. And all of this will bring forth serious issues on public health and mental health. So we looked at a lot of these primary and secondary impacts on Penang, and in order to help us focus on the few which are most relevant, most urgent in Penang, we actually, our team in PGC, we built a scorecard. We then rate each of these impact according to the urgency, frequency, severity, and then we picked a few that are that we will talk about today. So the first impact, sorry, I'm going to go through is food security. So food security, when it comes to climate change, it's very, very, very vulnerable. As you can see, food security is very much impacted by all these issues: temperature rise, drought, sea level rise, biodiversity loss. We also are impacted by the secondary impact of flood and diseases. So what we have here in Penang is we still rely on food import for certain things, like for example, veg and fruits. Majority of that are from outside of Penang. And for rice, yes, we have a lot of paddy fields, but our self-sufficiency rate is still about 60% generally. Yes, we might have enough poultry and pork, but we are also relying a lot on meat, like beef and goat meat from outside of Penang. So as it stands, we don't have a very good or secure food supply for within Penang. And climate change will add pressure to that system. So what I can say is all systems of food production, be it crop, farming, fishery, and livestock, are under threat. How does it work? So I'll just go through very quickly. Temperature. Increased temperature will put pressure on crop production. So crops, it affects crop phenology, such as the rate it grows, the physiological processes. This, I think, perhaps Dr. Khan will perhaps can give more illuminations and see water temperature will drive some species away. It's too hot for them. It will drive some species away. It will also affect livestock. In terms of drought, it goes without saying. Our paddy is pretty water intensive. Without a secure water supply, we might not have enough production. And also drought is also a problem for livestock farming. Sea level rise, I will show later with graphs. Sea level is predicted to rise to cover quite a lot of areas in Penang in a 2-degree increase scenario. By 2050, by 2100. Sea level rise is a threat to our paddy fields because a lot of our paddy fields are on low-lying lands. As seawater comes in, more inland, it will inundate freshwater aquaculture. So it will, again, impact on our food supply. Flood, it's almost the same as sea level rise. It will flood croplands. It will cause problems with livestock farming, for example. And diseases, climate scientists have predicted as temperature goes up, there will be more diseases or new diseases or pests that will affect crops, that will affect fishery and livestock. Lastly, but not least, biodiversity loss. This is something that affects all systems of production. As we get less and less species to rely on, we are focusing on just 1 or 2 species that are not, might not be resilient to temperature rise, to this salination of water. If we lose those species, we don't have other species to fall back on, there's not enough diversity, then our food security is under threat. This is just to show the green snow in Antarctica. This picture, I believe, was taken at the beginning of the year that encouraged algae bloom in Antarctica. And so instead of seeing a white landscape, you see quite large patches of green, which is algae bloom. And scientists believe that the area with green snow will keep expanding every year. So it talks about the severity, it shows the severity of warming. So these are graphs showing on the graph on the left, the map on the left is showing land projected to be below annual flood level in 2050. So this is different from sea level. It's not exactly the same, but this is just showing areas that will be flooded and the annual flood level every year by 2050. And if you look at the map of our agricultural land, so where we do our paddy cultivation, for example, because paddy cultivation is the main agriculture activities in Penang, you see that a lot of them intersect. So what does it mean? It means that our paddy cultivation, our freshwater aquaculture will be interrupted, will be disrupted more as we experience more flood events. Next is, these are maps that we took from Pepper Central. It shows the possible level of sea level rise in Penang in a 1.5 degree increase scenario. And on the right-hand side, there's increase of 2 degrees scenario. So as you can see, it is quite scary. I mean, I don't know about you, but for me, if I look at almost half of Seberang Perai underwater permanently, if we don't do anything about it, it is scary. Again, it intersects with the farming areas, the farm areas, the paddy cultivation areas that we have. And it shows that it will have a serious implication for our paddy. And going back to flood, I believe in 2017, when we had the serious flood where more than 100 areas flooded in Penang, this was pretty much the image that we saw. So we saw that more than half of Seberang Perai was underwater. And so this is not like, this is not unrealistic. It actually happened, but that was under the flood scenario. So that's about the food security. The next issue that I will be discussing is water security. So water security, Penang is water scarce state because we rely on 80% of our drinking water comes from Sungai Muda. And we know Sungai Muda is, it starts in Perak. So the upstream is Ulu Muda. So we don't have control over the source of our drinking water for 80% of our drinking water. So to start with, we are already water scarce. We are under stress, and we know that Penang has been working for many years now to improve the situation, to get extra water resources or to encourage consumers to cut down their water consumption. So when it comes to climate change, these few factors will affect our water security. So temperature, it's logical. The hotter it gets, the quicker water gets evaporated. Drought, this is a severe issue and it's not a new issue. So it's not like Penang has never experienced drought. In early March this year, the Ayutthaya Dam in Penang, the level has went down to 45%. And Teluk Bahang Dam had went down to 28% right, at the beginning of the year by March. But more worrying in the Muda Dam, which is one of the 2 dams that make sure that there's enough water level in Sungai Muda to supply the water to Penang. Muda Dam had gone down to 4%. So that was because beginning of the year, there were prolonged period of dry weather with no rain. So this is something that we have experienced. It's not like it's something that will happen in the future. This is something we have experienced. In terms of sea level rise, so apart from salinization of fresh water, so if we have been relying on our river, on Sungai Muda River for fresh water supply, when sea level rises, it means that seawater moves further inland. So that will affect the quality of our fresh water. So that means that the PBA will need to spend more money in treating the water before they can supply to us. Sea level rise can also compromise water treatment and distribution facilities. The same with flood water. During flood, it will probably affect the operation of PBA treatment, water treatment plants, or the overflow in sewage and stormwater drainage will pollute our freshwater supply. So this is just some graphs on drought. The graph on the left is showing the global mean temperature anomaly. So you can see the further it goes to the right, it means the anomaly is greater. So we can see that in 2016, the world experienced a really hot weather. You can see this corresponds with the graph on the right. The graph on the right shows the number of cloud seeding operations that Penang has had since 2015. And if you see in 2016, there were 11 instances of cloud seeding operations. So it got so dry that the government has asked for help or has launched cloud seeding operations. And then it went down. And if you look at 2020, so we have by 13th of May 2020, Penang has carried out 6 cloud seeding operations, and they are not free. Each cloud seeding operation would cost up to 27,000 ringgit. So if you can see that for this year, the trend is going to get hot, because in 2016, it was during El Nino year, the cloud seeding was needed towards the end of the year, because that's when it usually happens. But since the beginning of this year, we already needed 6 cloud seeding operations. If the weather continues to be hotter, becomes hotter, then we will need more. So actually, scientists have said that 2020 is on course to be the world's hottest since measurements began. So it says something. It's saying that scientists actually are surprised why it's getting so hot, because it's actually not El Nino year, but the trend is there. So we have seen the picture of green snow in Antarctica, and in January, temperature. Record temperatures has hit several places in Europe, in Antarctica, and in Arctic. So we see that I think we have to brace ourselves for another 2016-like year or even worse. So not helping with the situation is our very generous use of water. Our water tariff is the lowest in the whole of Malaysia, and not surprisingly, in Penang, the household water use per capita per day is also the highest. So in Penang, each household uses an average of about 280 liters of water every day. And that compares to the number in Singapore, which is 141 liters per day. So because water is cheap, people don't really recognize the value, the scarcity of the water. And so we just use water as if there's no tomorrow. So as you can see on the graph on the left-hand side, water consumption has steadily increased. And then the graph on the right is the projection of water consumption. And as you can see, it continues to rise. It doesn't fall, partly because of population increase. And PBA has been trying to get to start this Sungai Perak raw water transfer scheme, which is to diversify our freshwater, drinking water supply from 80% from Sungai Muda, to move some of that supply to come from Sungai Perak. But that scheme has been in discussion for the past at least 7 years, and it's been delayed and no agreement has been reached. So we are still waiting for something to happen, but before that happens, Penang is very likely to be water stressed within the next few years, given the population increase and increase in water consumption. So next issue is flood. We all know that Penang gets flooded every year. So part of Penang suffers floods few times a year. When there's heavy rain that continues for 2 hours, we know for sure that parts of Penang will flood. And it's not a victimless event. Yes, we heard about people losing houses and people suffer property losses, but also in 2017, apparently the most severe flood event in Penang, 7 people were actually killed. So in terms of flood, part of it are affected by climate change. So increase of storms, rainfall, and sea level rise will explain why flood events are increasing. But there are also other non-climate change factors that has helped to aggravate flood incidences in Penang, including concretization, meaning that we've cut down trees and plants. We turn this into impermeable surfaces, especially on sloping land, so that water, when it flows, instead of flowing slowly, absorbed by plants and trees along the way, it flows very quickly and directly onto the downstream area, where it floods in a bigger area of land, and also the intensity of flood is bigger. So increase of storms. So this graph is roughly showing that the intensity of typhoon central pressure. I mean, you can see that in the map. Peninsular Malaysia is under that increased pressure of central pressure of typhoon. So we are expecting storms to get more intense. And these graphs or maps are showing that on the left is the observations of what happened for the past few decades. And on the right is a projection of warming simulation. So it projects what will happen to tropical storms in Western North Pacific if the sea surface temperature increases by 3 degrees. So the conclusion is the total number of storms will increase, but not significantly. It's not like double, but the storms are getting stronger. Penang actually is not in the direct path of typhoons at the moment, but we suffer from the tail end of storms. As storms get more intense and closer to the north of, to the mainland of Southeast Asia, meaning Vietnam or Philippines, we will get more of that tail end as well. Lastly, in terms of increasing intensity and frequency of storms in Penang is rainfall. So as we saw at the beginning, local impact of climate change, we saw that rainfall has increased, the volume of rainfall has increased. But apart from that, what is also very crucial for the happening of flood and landslide in Penang is the intensity of rainfall, which is the volume of rain that falls within a day or within an hour. That intensity, as you can see in the graph represented by the blue line, has increased even within the past few years. So landslide. Landslides happen in Penang. We have this hill, especially on the island. We have this central hill in the center part, and landslides had happened in places. So and it has caused numerous fatalities. For example, in the 2017, we have the Granito landslide in Tanjung Bunga that claimed 11 lives, and then we have the landslide in Bukit Kupus in 2018. These are all recent events that claimed 9 lives, and last year, a landslide in Tanjung Bunga claimed 4 lives. So as we see the increase in the volume and intensity of rainfall, people are expecting that landslides, the incidence of landslides will increase. And rainfall itself, on its own, does not mean that landslides will definitely increase. Intense rainfall coupled with other things, for example, the soil properties of our land, for example, our hill is of granite formation. When it's disturbed, it will aggravate it will increase the possibility of having landslides, and also so perhaps unregulated or non-scientific development of our hillland will also increase the risk. So this is a map showing the landslide hazard. This is something, this study carried out a few years ago, looking at which areas in Penang are most susceptible to landslides. And we, in 2017, during the severe floods in September 2017, in Penang, we had, like I mentioned before, more than 100 places that are flooded. We also had 41 landslides in the state. And these pictures are just showing some of the things that are happening to our slope, which increases the possibility of having landslides. So the new roads that pierce through the granite core of the hill slope, as our hills mainly formed by granite, when it cuts through the granite core, expose it to weathering, it makes it more susceptible to landslides. And then heat wave. I think even my mom can feel that, you know, the days are getting hotter. I think this is something that everyone feels. And I'll be showing a few maps that sort of prove that it is happening. It's not just in our imagination. So heat waves affect human health in various forms, such as heat exhaustion, cramps, and heat stroke. It also causes other secondary health impacts, such as cardiovascular diseases, respiratory, and other chronic diseases. And in Malaysia, there's yet any systemic reporting of heat stress or heat stroke. What we have, hospitals have recording, you know, the instances of cardiovascular diseases or respiratory, but there's no direct link to heat wave, you know, this is the impact caused by heat stress or heat wave. This is something that we are still lacking. And in Penang, we are particularly susceptible to urban heat effect, because we are very built out, and studies have shown that actually in an urban area, the temperature difference between urban area and surrounding more rural natural area, temperature difference could be up to 8 degrees. So it could be 38 degrees in Georgetown, and then in other areas it could be 30 degrees. So the urban heat effect is a real problem for Penang, especially in the island. And this map showing the current situation of spatial pattern of heat wave characteristics over peninsula of Malaysia. A is about number, B is about frequency, C is duration, and D is amplitude. And as you can see, Penang is in red in most of the maps. It is showing that, you know, Penang, we are increasingly experiencing more hotter days. So this is projection. So this is expected increase of warm days per year in 2010s, 2050s, and 2090s. As you can see, we are getting more red in Penang. You know, we was pretty red to start with. By 2010, it was very red. By 2050, more parts of Peninsular Malaysia are getting red, and by 2090s, the whole of Peninsular Malaysia is red. And according to World Health Organizations, in 2050, Malaysia will experience 200 days per year with heat wave in a 3-degree increase scenario, compared to 20 days per year in 1980s. So generally, we know heat waves is coming. We are already experiencing heat waves because of the hotter days. So lastly, vector-borne diseases. So this is about dengue cases, malaria cases, and maybe perhaps other tropical diseases that will happen that we haven't, well, the paper hasn't really looked at in detail. So a 2016 study shows that the potential increase of malaria cases by 15%. It can increase by 15% if the ambient temperature increases by 1.5 degrees Celsius. And you can see the graph on at the bottom, population at risk of malaria in Malaysia has been increasing since the 1960s. And in terms of dengue, with more rainfall, and increase of surface temperature, we will get more dengue cases. And this shown in the graph at the top, where, you know, cases in Malaysia has increased as well. And in Penang, we have also seen increase in dengue cases. So with the warming temperature, with more rainfall, we will see a slide. I was hoping to be able to give you a happy ending, but obviously if you're talking about climate change impact, there's no happy ending. So we have discussed about the specific threats, impacts in Penang caused by climate change. Here, I just want to show some other additional socioeconomic costs of climate change in Penang. So we have flood, we know we have food security issues, water security issues, we have public health issues, we have disasters issues, and and all these are causing, you know, a lot of economic losses. We have human life losses. But what are the things that were threatening us? What are the implications of these on other socioeconomic aspects of the society. So one is financial costs, when citizens will lose out, when they lose their homes, when they lose their properties, and when the government has to invest in rebuilding the community. That will all cost money. And then we also have a problem of unemployment. For example, when sea level rises and inundates our paddy cultivation, farmers lose their job, their land, there's no means of living for them. So that will also cause unemployment problem. So inflation and recession, as we get less and less fish, for example, from our sea, prices will go up, or if we have to import more rice from outside of Penang, outside of Malaysia, prices will go up and it will might lead to the recession. And crime and conflict, when there is scarcity, especially scarcity of water, it might lead to fights or between community or between states or between countries. It might lead to crime and conflict about for getting scarce resources. Labor productivity in a hotter environment. For example, workers who have to work under the sun, construction builders, in a hotter environment is more uncomfortable, it's more threatening to public health. Their quality, their productivity, the quality of their work and productivity will increase. So climate change will also affect that. And lastly, human displacement. This is where, for example, sea level rise inundates permanently and the whole area, the whole community has to be moved. And also we have heard about climate refugees. Even if we are not exporting climate refugees, we might be seeing climate refugees coming to Penang. So how do we deal with that? So that's me. That concludes my part of the presentation. As I say, these are just some snippets that I got from our review paper. So if you have any questions or suggestions or thoughts, please put it on the comment section and we will take that into consideration. And the paper will be done in about a month's time. So thank you, and I will now pass the baton to Dr. Kam, Dr. Kam is a former academic staff of USM. She is a scientist, has been looking into climate change issues in Penang, has given a lot of talks, has had a lot of experience in looking at agriculture sector for security in Penang in particular. So the floor is yours, Dr. Kam.
Okay, thank you, Shin Wei. I guess I'm unmuted now. Can everybody hear me? Hello? Hello?
Yes, Dr. Kam, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks, Shin Wei. And I have been asked to kind of comment on what has been presented, which is a very good summary of the paper that the team, the Penang Green Agenda team has been working on to profile the climate change impacts and we focus on Penang. Okay, so I will give a few comments, but I would also like to kind of take us a bit to thinking what do we do after this review is done? How would this review feed towards more of positive action to be taken in Penang? Yeah. So I will just share my screen now for my presentation. Can everybody see the slides? Shin Wei?
Yes, we can see, yes.
Okay.
Suan, we can see, yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I kind of call this my short presentation, Penang at the Climate Crossroads. We are really at the crossroads now, and it is made even more stark to us, especially now that we are just emerging from another crisis, which is the COVID-19 outbreak. And I think we've got to think very seriously, okay? Yeah. Well, Shin Wei has given a very good, a comprehensive rundown of climate change with respect to temperature, rainfall, and so on. And I think from the presentation, it becomes clear that it is not only climate that's changing, that it also has its effects on coastal and ocean events like sea level rise, coastal extreme events, storms, tidal surges. And one thing that I think we need to also pay attention is the impact on ocean acidification and that impact on the marine resources. And I trust that Prof. Zul will be able to talk more about this aspect as well and how it is might affect our marine and fisheries resources as well. Shin Wei also touched upon the biotic stresses of pests and diseases that are likely to impact not only humans, but also our crops, yeah? And its impact on crop productivity as well as on human health. And with respect to that, what the impacts would be on food security. Now, this is one of the scenarios that has been put up based on whether, all the climate change scenarios are based on some assumptions of high emissions or medium emissions, whether we adapt or not. Okay, so here, this is a global look on what the food security situation is on medium emissions and high adaptation, which are assumptions that I'm afraid we are probably not going to be able to comply given the track record globally of how where we are heading to. But even then, we will see that on a global basis, food security issues are going to be very crucial, especially in the African continent, but also to some extent in the Asian region. Now, if we zoom in now to Malaysia and Penang, we talk about the impacts of climate change on local food production, as Shin Wei has pointed out. But I think what we need to be mindful is that Malaysia and also Penang is very dependent on food production from all over the world. This is a map that I made of what I call Malaysia's global food footprint, meaning where we get our sources of food from. And this one concentrates on cereals, flour, meal, and animal feed. The countries that are highlighted in yellow are our main importing countries from where we import these materials. And as you can see, it spreads all over the world. The numbers that you see in terms of volume of trade, like Australia has, we import the highest from USA, from China, and so on. And the letters that you see here denote the major food items that we import from these countries. Like, for example, Thailand, for sure, we import a lot of rice, we import animal feeds, and also meals and flour, for example, and so on. So, I mean, this is just to go to show that the impacts of climate change would be not only on our local food production, but also on our food imports, as well as imports of inputs for our agriculture, for crops, fertilizers, for livestock and fish, aquaculture. It will be the animal feeds, fish meals, and so on. So what will happen in terms of climate change on food security is not only on how our food production locally will be impacted, but how our imports from other countries will be impacted as well. Because naturally, every time that there is some impact on food production, for example, the drought in 2016 affected very badly rice production, and countries like Thailand and Vietnam actually cut down the export of rice, and the impact had been that our food prices would have gone up. So we should take into consideration from the point of food security, not only how it is impacting our production, but how it is impacting our possibility of getting food, our extent of self-sufficiency. Now, Penang, then the question is, what is the internal food footprint for Penang like? Penang being a small state where agriculture contributes to only a very small portion of the GDP. We are not only dependent on, we are dependent on food that comes from other states, as well as food that comes from the rest of the world. So we should put that into perspective, yeah. Now, I want to then talk about, if we understand what the impact of climate change and global warming situation is, do we respond or not? We put it into the context of, there's one way of looking at it, if it is really our fault or if it's not really us. If it is not really us, I mean, in the sense that, of course, we are part of the global environment, but these are the major global climate changes variables are basically contributed by the world as a whole. But at the same time, as pointed out in Shin Wei's presentation, there are also local environment development actions and environmental problems that actually can be exacerbated by climate change, like floods and landslides and so on. So there are aspects that are really partly our fault and partly, it is a global phenomenon. Now the question is, if we try to fix it or if we do nothing. So if it is really our fault and if we try to fix it, obviously then we take the stance that obviously we cannot prevent what has already happened, but we should try not to prevent it from getting much worse. Now, if it is really our fault and we do nothing, what will happen is our future generations will not forgive us, okay? Now, if it is not really us, but it's a global phenomenon, we will still have to, we'll have to try to fix it, because in the long run, we'll also have cleaner air and water, improve public health, conserve our non-renewable resources, yeah? So if we do nothing, we will swelter while we reckon that global warming isn't the only problem that needs fixing, because a lot of the tendency to view global warming is that it is a slow variable and climate change is a slow burning issue. But do we want to end up like this frog in slowly boiling water? You put a frog in a pot of tepid water, room temperature water, and increasingly increase the flame, the temperature rises slowly, but the frog isn't aware until it gets too late. So from this perspective, I would think that it is important for us, if we zoom into Penang, to examine the scenarios for response for Penang. Now, if we do nothing, it would be a business as usual scenario. But if we do something, then we ought to be looking at what scenarios and how do we, what should we be doing in order to increase our resilience, which means that we do not want to enter into a situation where the situation that we are at would get worse. We want to be able to be more resilient, yeah? And that if we improve cleaner air and water, conserve our renewable resources, it is basically a no regrets principle that even if climate change were to be miraculously reversed, there's still no regrets, that we should be doing things that will improve our health as well and our environment and well-being. Okay. Now, let's try to look at then what are the major issues that Penang may have to be focusing on. I want to put this in the context of the national response that Malaysia had submitted in the second national communication, the NC2, to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. Sorry about the spelling mistake. This is already quite dated because there's already a third national communication to the UNFCCC, but I want to go back to the second one because the third one tends to focus not so much on these thematic schemes, but more on environment and energy. In the second NC2, what has been identified for Malaysia has been the more thematic problems of drought, flood erosion, agricultural production, health, forest and biodiversity, and coastal and marine habitats. And these themes basically fit well into the kinds of issues that Shin Wei had pointed out. And you know, there's a long laundry list, as she has given, of the kinds of issues that Penang faces. Now, given that if action were to be taken, I guess there is a need to kind of look at what Penang's priorities are. And I think this is where this study or other studies that lead on from there would have to take a hard look at each of this and then see where the priorities might be. Of course, all of these problems do arise, but there are limits in terms of resources and capacity and urgency to address these problems. So perhaps the next kind of step to take is to look at each of this and then see, using various criteria, see where the priorities for actions in the near term, medium term, and long term would have to be. Now, I'm going to kind of just do a dashboard, kind of a quick guess, and I might be wrong, but this is where more studies will be done to be able to rank these priorities. Like, for example, drought as associated with water shortage, as when we pointed out, you know, Penang is actually very, you know, has a very high water deficit, would be maybe a 3-star priority. Flood and erosion, maybe 3-star, and so on and so on. Now, this is just an example. I'm not kind of prescribing this, but this is something that has to be studied more carefully and looking at the data, the impacts, the likely impacts, especially in the context of how we are now just emerging from the CMCO period, and people talking about having to come to a new normal, or what the CM talked about, the next normal. And I think there is still lack of clarity of what is defined as a new normal. And so all these priorities will have to be looked at in the context of where our future lies. Okay, Penang has always been like touted as something that Penang wants to move forward to be a smart city, but I would submit that not only should Penang be a smart city, but it should also be climate smart. Okay, and there are various aspects to talk about in terms of being climate smart. One is mitigation, and Penang being a small state, of course we want to reduce emissions and so on, But Penang is a small state and a small player nationally. And so perhaps the contribution of Penang to mitigation, while important, would be relatively minor. Yeah. But I think most important for people of Penang in their minds would be the two other aspects, which is preparedness, to trying to minimize the impacts, as well as adaptation, to reduce vulnerability and to build resilience. Now, in terms of preparedness, we have had a big lesson to learn from the November 2017 flood situation, and which was like caught us quite unawares. So the importance of having better systems for early warning of storm and tidal surges, flash floods, and landslides and slope failures. And in the event that an emergency occurs, that we are really in need of much more robust disaster response management in terms of emergency response, evacuation, shelter facilities, and traffic management. So these are more in terms of response to the impacts of disasters that would be exacerbated by climate change. From the adaptation point of view, I would like to kind of propose also a framework by which one could look at the various options for adaptations, whether it is adaptation with respect to food security, disasters, health, and so on. The common way by which people categorize adaptation, I put it into a 2x2 matrix here. One is what they call autonomous or reactive, and the other is planned or anticipatory. Autonomous and reactive is that when something happens, when a disaster happens, then you react in order to try to minimize the impact. The planned and anticipatory one is where, like if we know that sea level rise is going to be by how many centimeters within the next 10, 20, 30 years, or if we know that with climate change, rainfall is going to decrease by so much, or temperature is going to be increased by so much, and we are going to feel more heat and so on, then we have to plan ahead. Yeah. Now, among all these options, there are also options that are the hard options, which is more of like putting in infrastructure and so on, and the soft options, which are like policy-related behavioral change and so on. So just to give you an example of how one could fill in these cells based on the context of Penang, or Malaysia, or the world for that matter. So for example, for a reactive or autonomous adaptation, as I said, like in the hard case, in the public domain, you can have also public action as well as private action. In the case of floods, then of course we have to make sure that we have sufficient emergency flood response equipment ready, the boats, the pumping station, the equipment to pump water out and so on. Now the other, in terms of private, is like Shin Wei was talking about Heatwave getting stronger, and then of course more people will be buying and installing more air conditioning, which is not necessarily good for the global warming environment. Okay, then in case of soft, in terms of reactive, it could be like in the case of emergency damage, that relocation, compensatory payments, subsidies to affected communities, which we saw a lot in the recent COVID-19 outbreak. Yeah, so that's a public soft reactive. In private, perhaps people want to buy insurance premiums will increase, or if we are reactive about, like for example, the water crisis, we would want to reduce the water usage, and as been pointed out, Penang domestic consumers have the highest per capita water consumption in the whole of Malaysia. Now, with respect to planned and anticipatory kind of reactions, for the hard, we want to kind of anticipate and plan for better climate-proof infrastructure, maybe in the form of protective embankments, like has been shown. Seberang Perai, much of Seberang Perai land is very low, and it's actually, you know, if there is sea level rise, it's going to, you know, the elevation of many of the fields are going to be below the tidal range. Have better drainage systems, water retention ponds, and also more important in that, Penang is very urbanized by now, especially Georgetown, that we should be looking at how in our design and planning of infrastructure, buildings, roads, that we will have to try to make urban areas more spongy to be able to absorb the very rapid runoff that comes during a rainstorm. Many countries in the world, in China, all over in Europe, are moving towards making urban areas, you know, sponge cities. And I think we should be more serious about doing this. From the private point of view, you know, there's already a lot of the movement in the private sector to bring in green building technologies. Now, in this case of anticipatory, soft kind of reaction, to come up with climate smart policies, have better land use and transportation planning that would also reduce our emission load, integrated coastal management, economic incentives for efficient energy and resource use, and especially, as we know, in any disaster, it is the poor, it is the B40 group that's going to suffer most. And how are these going? How are they going to be protected in terms of proper insurance and financing schemes? In the private sector, again, you know, as anticipatory, you'll find that insurance, the insurance sector comes in important, and I think important for all of us as Penangites is to see how we should have lifestyle changes for conserving our resources. And I think there's a bigger movement, especially in the wake of MCO, when people realize that we are not going to get vegetables from Cameron Highlands or from other states, is to move towards more of urban gardening, peri-urban agriculture for safe and wholesome food. So, I mean, I'm sharing with you this as some thoughts of how, as we move forward to kind of say, how do we make ourselves more climate smart and climate proof, is to think of it of strategies and mechanisms within a framework like this that will allow us to approach it in a more holistic and integrated manner. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kam, for a very informative sharing session. Definitely, we need to look beyond Penang when it comes to food security. Just food production in Penang is not going to tell the whole story. And also, thank you for sharing your thoughts on disaster management adaptation in Penang. Just to mention a few things that initiatives that are starting to take place in Penang. So it has been proposed to the state government that we need a dedicated unit for disaster management that will have components of planning and community outreach within the work, not just reacting when something happens. That is already in the pipeline. We also have Think City working with various government agencies to carry out nature-based adaptation using upstream retention ponds, using trees to help reduce especially urban heat effects in Penang. And also PGC has been engaging with the two councils on inserting climate resilience elements into the local plans. So they are now being drafted, and we have been working closely with them to make sure that things that are currently not included in the structure plan will be included in local plans. Thank you so much, Dr. Kam. And I will now pass the baton to Prof. Zul, who will give us some further info on perhaps climate change and our seas and the marine resources. The floor is yours, Prof. Zul.
Thank you, Shin Wei. If I may share my screen with you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Hello everyone, I'm Zulfigar. I'm from the Center for Marine and Coastal Studies. I think we have had a lot of introduction on climate change this morning, but I would like to perhaps contribute a little bit on from the marine perspective of what's going to happen, especially to Penang when the climate changes. But before that, I would like to think about the marine environment. I think the most important thing is that unlike the terrestrial environment, the sea is an open system. And when you consider the marine environment, it is not bounded by a small perimeter such as the state of Penang. I have put this slide up to show you what had happened in 2004 when the Indian Ocean tsunami occurred in off the coast of Aceh, and we thought we were quite a considerable distance away. And what had happened was that the effect of the tsunami was to enrich the waters around Aceh. Now, if you trace the water movement a couple of days or 1 or 2 weeks later, that green spot, which is the enriched water from the northern part of the Straits of Malacca, traveled southwards right up to over here until Malacca, and it went subsequently to Singapore, which caused millions of dollars of fish kills due to eutrophication, enrichment of the marine waters in the Straits of Malacca. So what I'm getting at here is that although we are considering the impact on the scale of Penang, what happens around us in the region or in the Straits of Malacca, and especially in Sumatra, is going to affect us quite significantly. So although we are going to consider Penang in many instances in this talk, I think it would be wise perhaps to extend our attention beyond the borders of Penang, since many of the interactions and contributions from the surrounding areas are going to have impacts on Penang itself. Before, there was a mention on another aspect of climate change. We talk about the temperature rise and its subsequent effect of sea level rise. As the temperature rise, water expands, and half of that effect of sea level rise is due to the expansion of marine waters, which in fact cause coastal inundation around the peninsula of Malaysia, and especially in the coastal areas like Penang. But there is another evil sister or brother to climate change, and that is ocean acidification. Now, ocean acidification, I think for many of us who are new to it, is when the ocean, which is essentially alkali, becomes more acidic. The pH of ocean water is reduced, and animals that live in the ocean, which have adapted to the alkaline nature of seawater, is not able to cope with the new conditions, the new chemical conditions that is happening in the marine environment, in the seawater. Essentially, the pH of seawater is about 8.1 now, and seawater has the capacity to absorb a lot of CO2 produced by human industries, until it cannot buffer any more of this absorption, which results in the increase of acidity of seawater. And this acidity affects a lot of organisms that live in the seawater, especially the organisms such as the carbonate-rich organisms. For example, what I've showed here is the coral reef, which is essentially an ecosystem which is constructed of calcium carbonate or chalk. As the seawater becomes more acidic, you can see that a lot of the corals will not be able to cope with the new environmental situation and starts to degrade. So in this environment, not only is temperature critical, but the pH of seawater is going to affect the health of these ecosystems. And for many scientists, they think that we are going to lose a lot of our coral reef in Malaysian waters. We did a study before to look at what is going to happen if the seawater is lowered in the marine environment. There are areas in the sea which is notorious of thermal vents, underwater thermal vents. These are seepage that are in tectonically unstable areas, such as the areas in Indonesia where you have seepage of hydrogen sulfide coming into the water. This hydrogen sulfide reduces those vents more acidic. So by going to these places, measuring their pH and looking what survives around them would tell us, would give us a window into the future. If our future oceans are going to be acidic, what is going to be the nature of those oceans and what will be surviving in those oceans. So this is rather a scientific slide, but the take-home message here is that as the pH decreases, as the oceans become more acidified due to climate change, the number of corals families starts to reduce. So if you look at this bar chart, this is with normal pH. You have a high number of families, but as the ocean becomes more acidified, there is a reduction in the number of families. So you get fewer variety and biodiversity of corals, okay? And only the more sensitive species survive. So if you look at, if you dive in an area which is acidified, you will see a very poor coral reef indeed. And subsequently, animals that rely on these coral reefs to make their homes will also be reduced. But to those reefs that are left, if you look at their skeletons, over here, there is two photographs of the skeletons. One is in a normal environment, the other is in an acidified environment. And if you look at them under the microscope, you can see the normal is very smooth, it looks very healthy. While in acidified environment, you have a porosis, like the skeleton of an old man. Is pitted, is granular, and is very weak. So the acidified ocean also causes a weakening of the total reef itself. And if there is a large storm, as we will probably see when the climate change, a lot of these reefs will start to degrade. But unfortunately, what also is happening in the marine system is that many of these ecosystems which are carbonate rich, for example, the coral reefs, much of the plankton, which is the basis of food chains, will also degrade. So as the climate changes, the amount of food supporting the whole ecosystem will be reduced because the base of the food chain, the base of the food pyramid is going to be affected. So the plankton which feeds the secondary consumers in the ocean will start to be affected, and there is less food, and there is a knock-on effect, and eventually at the top of the food chain are the human beings, and we see a reduction in food. And I have to point out here that I had involved in the aquaculture trade on the problems with the cockle culture. The biggest fisheries in terms of landing tonnage for Malaysia is not fish, it is cockles. And this has been reduced by 85% in terms of tonnage in the last 5 or 6 years. So there is a drastic reduction. And it is no wonder that if you eat the Penang char kway teow, you can hardly find any cockles because they are now too expensive. It used to be 15 cents per kilo about 7 or 8 years ago. It is now 15 ringgit a kilo now. So you can see the jump in the price and the effect of reduction of cockles on the price of cockles in the market. And those are the very obvious things, but you can also see the price of fish has gone up. Previously, I think a generation ago, if you're poor, you eat fish. If you are the son of a rich man, you will have chicken. And I still remember that during the festivities, we would be looking forward to have chicken because the chicken is the thing to have during those special occasions. But now, if you are rich, you'll eat fish. If you are poor, as in the students of USM, if you look at them, most of them have chicken. And I see this about turn because the resources from the marine environment is being drastically reduced. The other impact of climate change, as we have seen, is the rise in sea level. I've put a graph there. You see as the temperature on the graph, it shows, and the water expands, and then you have a rise in sea level. We would probably reach about that mark, 1.5 degrees with a 3-meter rise in 2040, which is not very far away, which is on 20 years' time. But the projection is not good, it's still going up. And there are feedback loops that we still do not understand. For example, the albedo effect, the change of the ocean color as the ice in the poles melt. So it becomes darker and darker areas absorb more light and it tends to get more warm. So this is a feedback loop which causes not a linear increase in terms of temperature, but a higher rate of increase in temperature. Now, if you just consider Penang, for example, over here, on the left-hand side is the 2050 unchecked pollution. The amount of areas that will be inundated underwater, you can see a lot of blue specks along the coast. This is, who are not familiar, that is the worst case scenario created by the IPCC, International Panel on Climate Change, which is a big group of scientists looking at climate change. As the marine water rise, a lot of places will be inundated with water. But if you look at the future projection, the photo on the right hand side, so if you had focused only in Penang, you'll probably see the island of Penang is not going to be in too much trouble relative to, for example, what is around here. And if you remember what was said before, if you look at our food security, Penang has a lot of its food imported, not only from international, as Dr. Pheng pointed out, but also from the other states. We import a lot of rice and vegetables from our neighboring state of Perak and Kedah. But if you look at Kedah, it is all blue. So Kedah will not have enough food to be able to export any of that. And if you imagine, the inundation is not by fresh water, it is inundated by marine waters, and our paddy is intolerant of salt water, and just a small input of salt water will cause a drastic decline in the areas that is suitable for the planting of paddy. So, so if we are thinking of relying on our neighbors for import of food in a climate crisis, I think we have to rethink that thought. But look at the areas which is going to be affected in this scenario. Langkawi Airport is going to be underwater. Most of the paddy fields of Kedah is going to be underwater, and this is the north-south highway. So coastal infrastructure, roads and freshwater and food supplies is going to be affected here, right? For coastal ecosystems, we are trying to make a proposal at USM to the ministry to look at the impact of climate change on coastal ecosystems, and it doesn't seem to be going too well in the evolution of coastal ecosystems to climate change, and it is deemed to be very important for us to be able to predict the subsequent changes to a coastal system, since they are significant in their contribution to food security, to ecosystem services, and so on. So for coastal ecosystems, we have coral reefs, mangroves, seagrass beds, mud flats, sand flats, and open water systems, which are all going to be impacted by climate change. We have our culture, the Lembah Bujang historical sites, which is going to be underwater. And then as the climate evolve, we are going to get more severe storms along the coast, which also increase the impact on coastal erosion. And for people who live in Penang, the value of property is in Penang is going to be affected. We have the World Heritage Sites, which is a maritime site, and a lot of this is going to be affected by the climate. We have human residents, coastal residents, accessibility to these places, jetties and areas close to the coast, which is also going to be affected. We have aquaculture sites at Batu Kawan and Pulau Aman. Some of these sites are intertidal, for example, the cockle that we mentioned before. And incidentally, this area of Penang and Kedah is the second largest area in terms of fisheries production, next to only Sabah and Sarawak. So this is not only the paddy basket, but also the fish basket for the whole country. So this area is going to be affected by rising seawater. Now, IPCC itself has made some predictions, and most of it we see has come true. For example, this is a general timeline of what is going to happen when the climate changes. So we are at 2020 here. So what they have said predicted before has actually turned out to be true. For example, the increase in SST leads to increase of coral bleaching events. Not only are the corals affected by ocean acidification, coral reef are at the upper limit of the temperature survival range. So, and a small increase in temperature causes the corals to throw out the symbiotic algae, which gives them the color and turn white. And that's the term coral bleaching. And some of these, a lot of the corals on the reef will die and not recover. And corals are important habitat for fisheries. So due to that, by 2030, we expect up to 30% of the coral reef in Asian coastal waters will be lost. Incidentally, our coral reefs are the richest in the world because we are in the coral triangle, and losing 30% of the richest areas in the world is bad any way you look at it, right? Arctic Sea itself could be ice-free by 2040, and we have loss of biodiversity, hotspots, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. So this gives you some idea of the impact that is going to come our way. Now, we have looked at these impacts individually. For example, we look at drought, we look at temperature increase, we look at sea level inundation, and one thing that tends to be probably not highlighted is that this impact do not occur one parameter at a time. What happens is that sometimes 2 or 3 of these impacts occurs at the same time, and you have a more complex situation arising from multiple impacts on a given environment or a given location. So what can we do? I think Dr. Kam has mentioned something earlier, but I think from the discussions that we have had so far, there are some issues that arise, and we think that some of these issues would be worthwhile in exploring because they are important and need to be prioritized in our dealings with climate change. First and foremost, there need to be an increased awareness on climate change. It is something which is not abstract. Occasionally, we see a lot of impact on climate change, and people do not affiliate to them because they show areas of snow calving, and they see the polar bears on ice, losing their ice. And it seems that these things are so far away, but in fact climate change are happening across the world, and we are not excluded by these impacts. So the second thing is that we need to understand impacts on the local scale. A lot of data that we have had are data on a large scale, and they are mean climate data. For example, they do not tell you the ranges of climate that we see. The last IPCC in 2014, the report states that we probably have about 1.5 to 2 degrees C, which is more likable temperature. But if you were to measure temperature on open areas of the ocean or natural ecosystems, you will see that some areas have a much bigger rise in temperature because the range of temperature is much bigger than the mean temperature rise. And it goes beyond the ability of certain ecosystems to cope. And therefore you see the impact exacerbated in these areas. So we need to translate what is happening on a bigger scale to the local scale, because most of our management is on a local scale. we really need to look at this problem on that scale. We need to support carbon emission reduction initiatives. There's a lot we can be done. What was mentioned before, I think by Dr. Kam, some can be done locally, some can be done at a higher level. But we do need to support this carbon emission, because eventually it will affect all of us, whether we are doing something about it or not, is going to affect all of us. And Malaysia itself need to have a longer term plan to look at climate change, because climate change, if we look at it, we are talking about temperature rise by 2050 and 2100. Who plans for that? Does Malaysia plan for something in a 50 or 100-year range, or they plan for it in a 2 to 3 or 4-year range? So I think we need to have a long-term plan for Malaysia. Regardless of who you are going to be affected by climate change. And we need to know the mitigation and the adaptation measures, and what are our options? What are our options? And for example, if a lot of the coastal areas are going to be inundated, and there are the places where we have our paddy basket, where our rice come from, shouldn't we be looking at some of the lines of paddy plants which is more tolerant to salt and able to survive saline intrusions? I think China is doing some work of that. I think they've been doing so, and there was some success in doing that. I think Dr. Kam probably would be able to tell us more about this. And shouldn't we be changing our diet to something lower on the food chain? For example, our diet needs to probably incorporate food that are not traditional. Seaweed is a good example, although we tend to think that we are safe with what we have now, but it is not going to last very long, taking into account in what is going to happen to the environment. We need to reduce anthropogenic impacts. For example, areas that are susceptible to climate are also prone to man-made pollution. The essential approach is that if our ecosystems are in some way stronger and the limits are not overtaken by the climate, perhaps they will be more resilient to some of the climate change, some of the changes, some of the stresses due to the climate change. I think some of this we can talk about in the context of Penang as a state. For example, if there is going to be drought, shouldn't many of our large projects in Penang should take into consideration the design of water retention designs, architectures for Penang to be able to be more secure in terms of its water issues. So I think that's the end of my slide. So back to you, Shin Wei. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Zul. Thank you for a very detailed explanation of what's happening deep in the water. Because of time pressure, I have 3 questions, 2 to you and 1 to Dr. Kam, if you don't mind. So your first question, Prof. Zul, is by Victor. He's asking whether the recent algae bloom that impacted aquaculture sites in Penang and Perak, are they connected to climate change? And your second question is asked by Dr. Kam. She's wondering whether the reduction in cockle production is also due to the drop in supply of cockle spats because of loss of mudflat area. So these are your 2 questions, Prof. Zul. The first one is algae bloom, whether it's attributed to climate change. Second one is the reduction in cockle production, whether it's due to loss of mudflat area.
Hi, Shin Wei. Okay, thank you for the questions. I look at the list of participants here. We have with us Professor Dato Eileen Tan, I think, who is working on some of these harmful algal bloom and death arising from anoxia in water. Anoxia is a reduction or absence of oxygen in the water. Yes, climate might contribute to this because the sea surface temperature, the temperature of marine water rises. And as temperature of water rises, there is a reduction in the capacity of water to hold dissolved oxygen. So the water body becomes poor in oxygen in some areas where it is already poor. For example, in areas of aquaculture, the fish are starved of oxygen and subsequently dies. So there is one. But there is also, if you look at a lot of reports on a lot of the fish kills, they usually happen and coincide with the time of paddy planting in the coastal areas, where a lot of fertilization of the paddy fields occur. They put a lot of fertilizers, and we have the rains, and a lot of this gets washed into the water bodies and into the coastal waters. This causes enrichment in the coastal areas as the algae which blooms dies. It becomes a sponge and soaks up a lot of oxygen from the water, and subsequently that also causes a reduction in oxygen in the water. And fish without oxygen, as with many other organisms in the water, will subsequently die. So I think it is both a climate effect and it's also, I think, an anthropogenic, human-induced impact. This, I hope that answers that. And as to the supply of spats in the surrounding areas, there are several factors to that. First is that I looked at some of the growth data done by our students on the coastal areas in the past years. There is a reduction in growth. The rate of growth of certain cockles. And there's also a reduction in numbers of spat, number of cockles, density in the field. It's very difficult to separate out anthropogenic from climate impacts in the coastal areas. But if you ask me, my personal opinion, it is a number of factors, which includes human-induced factors such as pollution in the coastal areas, and then also a lot of cockles are being harvested before they reach maturity and sold. So there is no natural seeding of corals in the beds. For example, if you look at the cockles that is being sold, you hardly find the larger cockles that is being able to produce a lot of spats in the water. Spats are the cockle eggs and babies that repopulate the coastal area. They sell them because these cockles fetch a lot of money, not only from the local market, but also in the black market across the border. So these are also areas that causes a reduction in the amount of cockles. But I would also suspect that ocean acidification, which affects the younger cockles. If you look at the life cycle of animals in the water, it is the juvenile stages and the younger stages which are more sensitive to ocean acidification. So these are affected as well. So this attacks the life cycle at those young stage and causes a reduction in the population of cockles in the field. I hope that answers that.
Thank you so much, Prof. Zul, for a very clear explanation. We have one question, one but difficult question for Dr. Kam. This question is asked by Naveen. The question is, how can we produce more food while implementing adaptation and mitigation measures at the same time? I guess it refers to our crops and perhaps livestock systems. Thank you.
Okay, first I'd like to thank Prof. Zul for his answer on cockle spats. Yeah, switching to the question, if I understand right, how can we produce more food as part of the adaptation options? Am I right? Did I?
Yeah, because we know we need to take actions to adapt and to mitigate, but at the same time, we also need to increase the yield. So how can we achieve that, just roughly?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether the question is directed at producing more food in Penang or in Malaysia as a whole. If I take it that it is for Penang, yeah, and if we try to reduce the food footprint for Penang, we do know that Penang has not much agricultural area, but even then, from the map that you have shown, Shin Wei, of a land use map of Penang, we do actually have substantial agricultural area in Seberang Perai, a lot of which is rice cultivation. Yeah, and we do also have rubber and oil palm. Well, land use, the competition for land use is always there between agriculture and industry and urbanization, and also within agriculture, whether it is for food crops or for cash crops, industrial crops like rubber and oil palm, both of which are important to Malaysia's economy. If you look at the situation in Penang, we actually have quite a lot of area under rice, of which a substantial area, about 12,000 hectares, I think, is under the International Agricultural Development Project, IADP scheme, which is an irrigated area where it receives water from the Muda River, actually. And in fact, that area, not only is it subjected to the possibility of being impacted by sea level rise and seawater inundation, but is also subjected to the risk of water shortage for irrigation water. The Penang's use of water is like about 75% for agriculture and 25% for industry and domestic. So it is actually quite substantial. And I think in the sense, from the Penang point of view, I think that one has to look into the forward planning. If we want to reduce our dependency, we can never be 100% self-sufficient in Penang, but at least to reduce the dependence. And in reducing the dependence on other states, we also reduce the risk that we are subjected to in terms of the logistics of bringing food from other places. And I mean, you can see that we faced that problem during the MCO period when there was a restriction of movement and supplies were also affected. So the main thing to consider is how do we increase our food production to be more homegrown, yeah? And I think in terms of the kinds of food that we need in terms of agriculture, for Penang being an urban state, vegetables is a major proportion of the kind of food that we require. Of course, we need fruits as well, we need rice as well, but in terms of per unit area productivity, vegetables have a very high per unit area of productivity. So you don't really need much agricultural land in order to produce vegetables. The main thing is to kind of to see how to implement strategies and projects for more sustainable vegetable production in urban or peri-urban environment. And there are many examples that you can see around the world, for example, in Taiwan, even in Cuba, where there is a more concerted effort at modernizing urban and peri-urban agriculture. There are also like now movements towards going into soilless agriculture, which is like using hydroponics and aquaponics, which are also suited for urban farming. In fact, it's not to say that there's no movement already. If you see, there are actually small initiatives that are done by people to do organic farming, soilless agriculture, and so on. But these are individual initiatives, and what I feel that can provide the incentive and push is for the state to kind of take the leadership to initiate an urban farming movement that can produce food in more sustainable and healthy ways. I do not want to elaborate on this, but there are so many examples that can be looked at. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. Thank you. Yeah, it's a difficult question, but it will bring us nicely to our next session. But before that, I just want to say that the recording of this webinar will be put on our YouTube channel, PGC YouTube channel, and all registered participants will be sent the slides. If you want, actually, you can ask us. And also, please feel free, if you still have questions, please send it to the Mela's email, which she has put in the comments chat section. We will put the answer. We will answer you on our Facebook. And before we end, I just want to promote a bit our next session. So this is our first webinar. Our next webinar will be discussing in depth the issue of food security. So it things that Dr. Kam has been explaining in depth. So for that session, hopefully we'll get some representatives from the agriculture department, fishery. We will also be discussing, how to increase the welfare of farmers so that we get people, who want to participate in agriculture, and also what are the alternative approaches or crops to agriculture. So that session will take place on the 2nd of July at 10 o'clock. So it's also Thursday in 2 weeks' time. But that session will be preceded by another of our PGC's event called the Sembang session. The Sembang session is an informal session where PGC interviews experts on certain issues, and that particular issue for the 30th of June, the Sembang session will be interviewing practitioners engaged in urban farming. So the Sembang session will be talking about green food in the city. It will be followed by our Penang, climate change in Penang series on webinar on the 2nd of July. So they will be in the same week. So I would like to thank everyone again for participating. But before